Hi, everyone. I think that we are live. Yes. So, welcome. Today we have a very different, I guess, a very in-depth talk about what's the data for the last 10 years in the appellate court has said about parental alienation. And we have the honor to have with us very special guest today. We have Dr. Jennifer Hammond, who is a social psychologist and a professor at Colorado State University, and Dr. Loranders, who is a forensic psychologist as well as a very experienced trial lawyer. So thank you so much for being on the show. Dr. Hammond, would you introduce a little bit of what your work has been?
Yeah, so thanks, and thanks for having us on here today. Yeah, so I've been studying parental alienation now for almost 10 years. I'm kind of a newbie to the area relative to everybody else, even though it's been a while. And a lot of my focus, because I'm a social psychologist, a lot of my focus is really on how people influence each other. So that's why I'm really interested in this topic, is that how can parents influence a child to really dislike another parent so much and hate them, and how is that possible, and how do siblings and therapists and other people contribute to that. But when I started getting into it, I started really understanding this wasn't just child abuse, that a lot of the behaviors that were being described by parents were intimate partner violence behaviors, which resonated with my own experience of being somebody who's a survivor of domestic violence. And I was like, God, a lot of these behaviors that they're doing, they're just using their child to keep doing it. Like so a lot of people are able to leave a relationship that's abusive. And if they don't have children, they can kind of move on. But if you have children with somebody who's very abusive, whether you're a male or female, you have to keep interacting with this very abusive person. And they're using the children to do that. And so a lot of my research has really been trying to understand that better. And I've been kind of always baffled at why there's so much, and we could talk about this today, but why there's just so much controversy around parental alienating behaviors when it's the same behaviors that somebody who's been abusive does to continue to abuse the other parent, just using their children to do it. And then the children become collateral damage in the process, and oftentimes, sadly, active participants in it. So that's kind of what got me into it, is just seeing the tragedy of that, seeing the parallels of all these kinds of family violence. And so I started really trying to understand it better in my research. And so that's kind of it's what inspired me to keep going and understand this better. And so now I have all sorts of projects that I've been working on to try to understand that.
Well, in the chat room, people saying Dr. Hammond is amazing, and Dr. Loranders, thank you so much for your publication. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. Make sure you please, click like and help us share this. If you are not sharing it on your own Facebook, please share it in, all the different groups that you are part of, because we want to make sure that people get access to this. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please go onto our website at victim2hero.com and subscribe. So Dr. Loranders, what about you? Could you share with us some of the work that you have done in this field?
Sure. I've been a psychologist since the mid-1960s of one sort or another. I've been a lawyer since the early 1990s of one sort or another. And for about 25 years, I've been publishing material to help judges and lawyers and experts understand the difference between good science and junk science, because we want to make decisions in court on the basis of good science, not junk science. So the 2-volume set that I created with my co-author Terence Campbell, who unfortunately has passed, called Cross-Examining Experts in the Behavioral Sciences, is now in its 20th year of publication with an update every year. And this summer, a 3-volume set will come out called The Litigator's Handbook of Forensic Medicine, Psychiatry, and Psychology from Thomson West. We've been working on that for about 7 years. We have 34 contributors from 5 countries, maybe even more than that, I think now. In any event, it's all aside from litigating or being an expert in court or training lawyers or training judges, my field has primarily been helping people understand the difference between junk science, fraudulent science, cargo cult science, and good science.
And that is so important, right? Because I mean, there's such a it's so critical to have ethical scientific work because science has such an impact in life. And if you lack that social responsibility as a scientist, then you can really cause so much harm. And we're talking about millions and millions of victims here. Actually, one of the audience in the room was asking, "How can you please give the number of affected children?" Children victim, would you have the number, either of you?
I think the best estimate that I've been able to come up with was based on a representative sample of adults in the United States. It was a paper I published back in 2019. And unfortunately, we could only estimate from assuming one child in the family. We know you could probably double this figure because usually there's more than one child. But it was about 3.4 million children that are moderately to severely alienated. Now, that doesn't include the mild cases. So kids who are having problems and are maybe on the way to becoming moderately to severely alienated. And that's about 1.4% of the US population at minimum. So it might be double that because of siblings and adding in mild cases. And that's just a little bit more than what other people have estimated using different calculations. So that study where we had a representative panel, or a panel that represented the US population, can be generalized to the US population. And it kind of confirms what other people suspected. If not, it's actually higher than what was previously expected. So
Thank you. And thank you, Laura and Laurie and Mary, everyone in the chat room. Heather, thank you so much. Rebecca, and I saw, Deanna is sharing, Sanjeev is sharing this. Thank you, you guys. And yeah, feel free to post questions. We're going to try to pick up as many as we can. So today, in particularly, we're going to be talking about a study that both of you published, right, in last year, a few months ago. And this study, you look at 10 years of appellate court data. And by appellate court, we're talking about the appeal cases, right? Would you tell us why you decided to do this study? And yeah.
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to do the study was because there had been another study published by Professor Joan Meyer and a team that she was working with, that was published in a journal that did not appear to be peer-reviewed. And it wasn't a scientific journal, it was a law journal. And there were a lot of claims made based on the findings of that paper that really concerned me. They made it seem like, oh my gosh, a lot of women are getting their children taken away from them, and that alienating fathers were just abusers and they were getting their kids. And there were a lot of things that were being said in the paper that were really concerning. And if they were true, we should look into that more and see if, replicate that. And, as a scientist, we always have to replicate, because the only way you can really show something is reliable or trustworthy is if you can replicate it again using a different sample or a different, method. And so I was really concerned about it when I read it. And then I reached out to Demos and I said, did you read this paper? Maybe he could tell you more about what happened from that point on.
So we met at a professional meeting, and it was sort of a shock that we both showed up at the meeting with copies of the student edited paper by Myers and her colleagues, swimming in red ink and sticky notes. And we thought, holy Toledo, is it true that judges are doing a terrible job? Is it true that when women are abused, their claims are just thrown out? Is it true that guardians ad litem are doing a terrible job? And we thought, well, wait a minute, this is bad news. Contemporaneously, I had been asked by the editors of a special issue of the Family Court Review if I would comment on Joan Meyer's study, because I had been asked to write a piece for the special issue, and I described parental alienation cases in the United States for 34 years and described how many there were, and et cetera, for this particular journal. And so I wrote in that article that that these are important questions that the Meyer team was asking. And so I asked Professor Harmon if we could make the conclusions from the student edited paper of the Meyer team into hypotheses and test them against a database that I had just published about. And Dr. Harmon set up a blind system so that I could not have any influence over selection of cases, and set up a system so that we could do really good science and restrict ourselves to really rigorous methodology and test these hypotheses to find out if they were reliable.
So you mentioned about hypothesis. So what was the hypothesis that you decided to study, to examine?
Well, in the original,
all the hypotheses in the Meyer paper, all of the conclusions, we made them into hypotheses to test them, and Professor Harmon can tell you more about that.
Yeah, because in the original paper, there weren't really very specified hypotheses, like they weren't very clear to begin with. So what we did is we had to kind of work backwards and reverse engineer it. And so we looked at what they were reporting as findings. And we're talking about all over the media, as, oh my gosh, look at what's happening to women when they say that they've been abused. So we turned those into research questions and ultimately hypotheses. And one of them was that when a woman makes a claim that or I guess the first, I can go in order. There were a lot of them. We tested about 6 of them. But one of them, that is, if a mother was engaging in behaviors that were undermining a relationship with the other parent, then she's more likely to lose the case, lose custody, and get a decrease in parenting time than a father doing the same behaviors. And I can tell you, we didn't find any support for that. I'll just tell you what we found. We didn't find any support. The only support we found is that if a parent was alienating a child and was found to have been alienating by a child by either a custody evaluator or the court or some sort of professional who was appointed, like a GAL, to work on the case, they didn't find gender differences, or we didn't find any. So moms and dads were not as more or less likely to have this happen to them. The next hypothesis was that this would happen even if there was an allegation or a finding of abuse against the father. So in other words, if dad was found to be abusive and mom was alienating the child, that she would be more likely to lose custody than the other way around. And we did not find support for that either. There was also a claim in the findings of the Meyer paper that when moms claim abuse and then dad says that he's being alienated, that the mom's claim of abuse would be discredited. Like nobody would believe her. And we didn't find support for that either.
Actually, I just want to jump in there that it was so widespread actually when I started, like before I even learned about parental alienation, just as a victim, when I actually heard that spreading around, actually, I was actually really worried because I'm going, wow, so I'm a mother who is a victim of domestic violence. And if I go to court and say that I'm a victim of domestic violence, I would lose custody. And like talking about spreading that kind of, as a victim, you're already so hopeless and helpless. And then having this kind of information, I mean, hope is sort of like the first thing that parents need. Losing hope is just like you losing everything. And so, yeah, it was, I should want to point out, like, personally, that's what I experienced with that piece of information, or misinformation, I should say.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's part of me, too. I was a victim of domestic violence. And to hear that's what's concerned me. And I was like, well, if this is really true, we need to find out. Right. Another one, another hypothesis that we tested was whether if moms claimed abuse and the dad was claimed alienation, that they would lose custody. I think that I already mentioned that one. That she would lose custody, lose the case. So we added those two, and lose parenting time, and we didn't find that to be the case. We didn't find that involvement of a GAL or a therapist or a custody evaluator or the court made any difference. Like that didn't affect it, meaning like they weren't biased in that. They had tested this hypothesis that if a parent made a sex abuse claim and a child abuse claim, and one or either of them was found to be true, that dads would get custody. Even though it was, like just one or both of them. And we didn't find that the case. In fact, there were very few cases where that even happened. Or even was an allegation where there was both of them being alleged. But that didn't happen. And then the last one that we tested is one that we came up with ourselves, is if a mother made false allegations of abuse against a dad, would he be more likely to lose parenting time than her if it was like the other way around? And for that one, we didn't actually find gender differences. So that one wasn't supported. That was ours. But we did find that if you made an allegation of abuse, regardless if you were a mom or a dad, that it was effective in getting more custody on, and getting the other parent losing parenting time. And that is horrifying.
That is,
and that's very sad. That's something that people have been writing about for a long time, is like allegations are the silver bullet of custody, and our data supported that.
Yeah, that's really, really sad. So someone, Laurie, I think, asking where the paper is. So if you go on our website, victimtohero.com, you just search for Dr. Hammond last name, for example, or any Wood or Dr. Lorandos, you will see that we post that paper. The paper is not behind a paywall, so you can actually just get the full paper without having to pay for it, and it's on the link is on our website. So actually, let's look at the talk about the data a little bit. So okay, you went into the appeal cases, the appellate court cases for the last 10 years, and you look at how do you pick these cases?
Well, just before we go into that,
okay,
would you mind, Jennifer, would you mind, Peter, would you mind if I talked about the structure of the research that we did?
Sure, yes, please.
Why? Because we did not aim to publish this in a student-edited journal. We aim to publish this, we aim to give this to the community of scientists and have the community of scientists see if we were doing a good job. Jennifer, would it be okay with you if I talked about that a little bit?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So we made sure that when we started to do this, that we would come up with a methodology that we felt that scientists would agree is the proper methodology. And we published that. We put that out on the Open Science Framework to get comments or to see if anybody had any suggestions. The Meyer team didn't do that. So then we pre-registered our hypotheses so that they were embargoed, so that we couldn't fudge the data later. So we couldn't make stuff up after the study. Our hypotheses were embargoed. The Meyer team didn't do that. We defined in a replicable way what we meant by alienation cases. The Meyer team didn't do that. We provided lots of details about who the people were who coded all of these cases that we looked for. Professor Harmon was rigorous in making sure that the coders were blind to the study's hypotheses. She was rigorous in making sure that they were double trained and double coders, and all discrepancies were resolved. The Meyer team didn't do that. We made our coding methodology publicly available. The Meyer team didn't do that. We had all of the documentation about how cases were coded available and published on the Open Science Framework. The Meyer team didn't do that. We clearly described how we included cases or did not include cases. The Meyer team didn't do that. We clearly described what our statistical models were going to be, and the Meyer team didn't do that. We described all of the statistics accurately, rigorously, up one side and down the other, because we knew it was going to the community of scientists for peer review. The Meyer team didn't do that. We submitted our material to a premier scientific journal and asked for rigorous peer review. The Meyer team didn't do that. So structurally, what we did was science. And what they did was not science, in my opinion, in any event, as a scientist and as someone who teaches the subject.
I mean, could we break it down a little bit for parents? Okay, so you cover a lot there, and so one of the things you're talking about is register things on the Open Science Framework and I know that the other day we share a presentation that Dr. Hammond did, and she kind of touched on it a little bit. But just for the parents that are watching right now that did not hear that, would you, like either of you, explain what the open science framework is about and why is it important?
Sure, I can take that one. um, so the open science framework and open science practices, they've really kind of exploded as a general expectation in the sciences over, I'd say, the last 10 years. The reason is because there were problems with replicating science. You know, a lot of times people were publishing papers and other people tried to go and directly replicate what they did and they couldn't do it. And a lot of it had to do with, you know, sometimes people would tweak their data a little bit, or they would misreport data, or they wouldn't report all their findings or all the things about their methods. And so it made it impossible for people to actually try to replicate what they did because they don't report enough information in what they're writing. And then there were problems. People were started to expose fraud. Like there were people who were misrepresenting their data and fabricating data. And there were several high-profile cases of that. And so when they saw that some scientists were not reporting all their results in their papers, that it was questionable how they did their analyses, you know, what choices that they made before they actually did their analyses, then people started to say those are kind of questionable research practices. And so they wanted to find a way to be more open. So that way anybody can go and look at what they did. And then there's more transparency, right? So you can trust that what somebody's reporting is accurate. And other people can check it, right? Other people can check it. So Open Science Framework is one of the places where it's like a software platform where people can go and post their projects. They can post their research questions and their hypotheses. They can post their data. They can post anything up there to make it really transparent. And so that's what we did. And a lot of journals are expecting that. Scientific journals are expecting that. And so when Demos and I met, this is back in 2019, in the fall, when we met in person, and both of our heads were exploding as we were reading the paper going, I can't tell what the Meyer team did. You know, I as a scientist, I sat there and read it, and I read the paper, and I know for a lot of people who read it, that are alienated parents, they emailed me saying, this just doesn't feel right, but they couldn't tell why. So I sat and read it before I contacted Demos, and I you know, as a scientist, I was looking at this going, what? You know, like, so here's an analogy. So I'm not a lawyer, right? I do not pretend to know law. I don't pretend to go and write as an expert on the law. I couldn't do a legal analysis and then go publish it anywhere and pass myself off as a lawyer. I couldn't do that. And if I did that and tried to publish a legal analysis in a psychology journal, and it got accepted for publication, and then somebody like Demos picked it up and read it, he could say, this person doesn't know law. Whereas the psychologist who reviewed the paper would look at it and probably wouldn't have known the difference, right? But because I didn't stay in my lane, I wouldn't, I'm appearing like I know something about the law to other psychologists, even though I don't. Whereas an attorney would look at me and go, one look at my paper, and they would say, she's not a lawyer. That's how I felt when I looked at the Meyer paper. I'm a scientist looking at it, and like what Dima said, I was like, this does not look like science at all. There's not methods that are reported clearly, accurately, the way that the hypothesis, they weren't even structured in a way that it was clear what they tested. There's no statistics reported. And of course, it was published in a law journal. So I'm assuming that probably the people who reviewed it probably didn't know the difference either. And so it's kind of like this idea that, you know, if you're going to publish it and state, you know, you need to kind of stick with what you know and what your training is. And if you're somebody who's reading it and doesn't have that training, it's going to be hard to know what is good science and bad science, which is kind of what Demos knows a lot about as well.
Right. So. And then, I mean, obviously, the importance of transparency in science is so important because, I mean, the whole point of science is to build humanity forward. So we need
Right.
transparency so that everyone can know that this is solid science. You also mentioned about peer reviewed. Okay, what is that about, and why is it important? Just for all the audience, all the parents out there that are not scientists.
Right. Peer review does not mean you gave it to a friend and had them read it, right? And it
Or
doesn't even mean that you had a
or
book.
that you give it to the students and say, "Wow," or that you send it to a granting agency and say, "Here's our ideas, send us some money." None of those are peer reviewed.
No, they're not peer review. Like, and so for example, the grant process. If you apply for a grant, somebody reviews your proposal. That doesn't mean that your final product is peer reviewed. That's not what that means at all. Or your methodology, right? A lot of times they just approve the idea. They don't approve your code book. They don't approve the statistics that you ultimately use. That's not peer review. And unfortunately, I've seen kind of around, I've heard from people saying that that's what the Meyer team did, that their study was peer reviewed because it got a grant approval, but that's not at all what peer reviewed means. Peer reviewed means you have a review board that assigns reviewers who review your paper, who are your peers, meaning your professional peers. And depending on the journal, there's lots of different kinds of journals. This is what people don't understand either. It could be a journal that's designed just for lawyers, right? Or it could be a journal for psychologists who are clinicians. It could be a journal for scientists, right? And the editorial board that's on that journal are people who are selected who are the peers who know that area, right? If it's a scientific journal, it means that the people on that board are scientists who've done science, who know how to publish science, they know how to do different kinds of methods, and they know how to evaluate the papers that come in there. Now, if you submit it to a practice journal, you're going to have people who maybe don't know science. They're going to know practice, right? And they're going to critique it from that perspective. And so the editor's job at a journal is to find reviewers who will review your paper. And some journals have what we call a blind review, which is the best way to do it. Because with a blind review, nobody knows who the author is. And that helps protect biases. Because if you have a bunch of reviewers who are reviewing their friend's work, they're going to maybe overlook things that a more critical eye would look at if they were, not trying to be biased, right? And you can see that sometimes with special issues of papers. Special issues in a journal are usually editors that have been selecting. They select authors who they want to submit a paper to, and they're friendlies, so they're not going to be as critical of the editorial. They know who they are, right?
Right.
Now, I don't publish in those kinds of journals because I'm a scientist. I publish in scientific journals where there's a peer review process that is blind, so the reviewers do not know who I am. All the information about me is taken out of the paper when I submit it so that they just evaluate it based on the work. And there's scientists who review the work. And that's very important.
So one of the things that was particularly important to me when Professor Harmon and I met about this was I've been teaching lawyers and judges for years that one of the criteria for reliability is having an expert who can actually do the kind of science that they're talking about in court. If she comes to court and she has a track record of publishing, doing the kind of science that she's there to talk about, that certainly is given a lot more weight than somebody who just says, trust me, I know what this is about. So we made sure that the way we went about things was so rigorous that we could submit it to a high quality journal where the reviewers, remember, we were blind, they were blind who we were, where the reviewers could actually do this kind of quantitative science. And this is a hybrid analysis that blends a variety of methodologies, but certainly quantitative analysis of the coded cases had to be reviewed, not by students in their student journal, but by scientists who could do this stuff.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up some comment and question in the room. So Jeremy, yeah, the torture is really real. And some, I think Ruby or someone mentioned about foster parents. Yeah, alienators can be other people. It doesn't have to be your exes. You know, it could be other people like foster
Mhm.
parents and extended family. I know there was some question. I miss it now, but question about whether Dr. Lorandos would take their case. From what I understand, Dr. Lorandos, you have retired, right?
Yes, I refer all of the legal representation to the law firm of Joshi, Joshi, attorneys and counselors in Ann Arbor, because Ashish Joshi and I worked together for many years. He's an incredibly good lawyer. He's just brought out a very good book on litigating parental alienation cases, and he is the first call that I would make if I needed a lawyer in this regard.
Yeah, so I wanted to point out that Dr. Lorandos have retired. So that's why today in this conversation, he's not here to try to pitch job. He's not trying to build further his brand or anything like that. It's entirely um, unbiased. And the other thing is Ashish Joshi. If you guys miss it, we have done 2 interviews with him talking about the strategy to fight parental alienation in court. So you can look into our videos tab on Facebook or on our website. You find it, and there's also the link to where you can get his book that Dr. Lorandos just mentioned, litigating parental alienation. So yeah, and then another question in the room that talking about, let's get to the data. One of the reason why there's this discussion, I guess, is that the Meyer paper has got a lot of attention in the media, and a lot of parents are wondering why. I mean, I see a lot of questions there, like why things hasn't changed, why doesn't the system recognize, why don't we have law that are recognizes? And part of it is because when you have misinformation out there about parental alienation, then you will have lawmakers that make the wrong kind of decision when it comes to creating laws that protecting you and your children. And also when you have the media that's spreading, the wrong kind of information, then you will not get the right kind of support from the public and from people around you, from the community, from professionals out there, get guardian ad litem therapists, psychologists. So that's why we have the 2 doctors here have just spent so much time explaining how important it is to recognize misinformation from solid scientific work. And so yeah, we're definitely going into the finding. So you went into the appellate court cases of the database and look at 10 years, and you pick out how many cases, and how did you pick these cases?
Right. So I told Demos we needed about 1,000 cases because he had identified, his team on a separate study had identified all the appellate cases where alienation had been found. And then there was also a lot of alienation cases that came up in the search where it hadn't been found, where somebody just went to court and said, I'm being alienated, but it wasn't found to have happened, right? So it could be just an allegation. It could have been a true allegation or not, but it wasn't determined by the court. And so I told him I need 500 of those cases where alienation was found, and I need 500 where it was just alleged, where somebody just said it. And then I need half of each of them to be where the mom was the alienating parent or the alleged alienator, and the other half to be where the dad was the alleged alienator.
And to be sure that Professor Meyer insisted, contrary to what Professor Meyer did, Professor Harmon insisted that we had to be scrupulously careful and we determined that we would start with the most recent cases and just walk back case by case by case in the 3,000 or so cases where somebody had complained that there was alienation, but the court hadn't found it or an expert didn't testify to it. And we walked through the 1,100 or so cases where the court had found or an expert had found there was alienation. And we just started with the most recent and walked back with no attention to where they came from or who was involved. But Professor Harmon insisted that we had to have 250 cases that were substantiated alienation, where the moms were the alienated parent, 250 where the dads were the alienated parent. And then from the cases that were not substantiated by the court, 250 where the dads made the allegation that alienation was happening, and 250 where the moms made allegations that alienation
Right.
was happening. So it was clear, even across the board, which of course is very different than what the Meyer team did, because of course we were making all this information readily available, and we couldn't get any of that similar information from the Meyer team.
Right. Yeah. So we, and I made sure that the people on his team who did that didn't know our hypotheses. So they didn't know anything about what we were testing. We just told them what we needed. And then we got the data set from them, or I got the cases from them. We trained, I think in total, 19 undergraduate students who were graduates or graduate students in psychology on the coding forums that we had created. And they went through each case, 2 people on each case after they were trained. And I made sure that before they did it, they had to write down what they thought the hypotheses were at the very beginning and at the end. That way we could make sure that they were still blind to the hypothesis at the end, and that their coding was not being influenced by what they believed. And then I also collected data on all of them. So I knew what gender they were. I knew all these things so that we could report to people who read our paper, who did the coding? You know, what did they know? You know, could there potentially be biases in what they're coding because they believe they know what the hypotheses were? So we were very careful about collecting that before and after, and all of that is up on Open Science Framework.
Because
all of that information.
We knew we were not going to send the results, whatever they may be, to a student-edited journal. We were going to send it to a scientific journal and subject it to rigorous review by scientists.
Right.
Yeah, so your paper eventually was published by a journal by the American Psychological Association, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was published in Psychology, Public Policy, and Law, which is a really good forensic psych journal, one of the top ones, and a really good paper, a good, really good journal with the APA.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so the way that we, did the science, I mean, so people coded it, and then what we mean by coding is you have like something you want to pull out of the appellate case that they were looking at. And so let's say the gender of the parent. So you would give it like a 1 or a 0. If it was a 1, it was a dad. If it was a 0, it was the mom, right? And so we had codes for every little thing that we were looking at. Was there a GAL involved? It got a number, right? And then that goes into a data set. And then that data set is also available on Open Science Framework. And so we coded abuse, allegations of abuse. Did anybody say something, and who investigated the allegations? What did they find? And it wasn't subjective coding. In other words, we weren't imposing our opinions on it. We only coded if it was there or not. Did someone report that somebody lost custody or not? Did they get a decrease in parenting time or not? We didn't assign any meaning to that. And so we didn't say, oh, if moms lose custody, it's worse for them than dads.
But we did not exclude things, because remember, these coders were blind to the hypotheses. So they weren't just excluding things that didn't fit with their paradigm.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, on your paper, and for parents that looking at the paper, if you look at the table 3, there's some explanation of the codes and also Appendix A. So for parents that are looking at the paper, you can actually find the information there for the coding. For example, what is the abuse case that was found, or things like that. How do you code a mother or a father case? So, and then if you go to the Open Science Forum, you can actually download the whole data set. And actually, that's what I did. I downloaded this whole data set, and you can, because there are parents there that are asking different questions, and you can go in there and you can find whatever information you want, really, because everything is there. You can actually just look at it yourself if you wanted to check out specific cases. All the cases are listed there. The information, if like like she was saying, if there was a guardian ad litem involved, whether the case was parental alienation was against a mother or a father, was there sexual abuse allegation, was there, Hulu's custody, things like that. So you can get all that information.
Yeah.
So,
and I think what's important, Petra, is that
yeah.
these are appeal cases, and they're publicly available cases. So there's no reason to hide any of this. That's why we posted it up on Open Science Framework. You can see all these cases. Anybody can go and search them and find them. So there's no hidden protected like health data, privacy data. These are publicly available court rulings.
Right.
And so it makes it possible then that we can be transparent with all of this. So that's why you can go on there and look at our codes. You can look at all the data set. You can look at, if you're a parent who had an appellate case that was alienated in the last 10 years, your case might be in there. It probably was. So you can go and find it. Yeah.
So I went into your data set, the spreadsheet, and I kind of, just because I'm curious about it, and I kind of try to understand the result in the layman's terms. And I mean, we kind of discussed this a little bit. Do you want to walk through it, or do you have it in front of you, or do you want me to walk through it, or
Sure.
how?
Maybe you can walk through it. I have, again, because we wrote this paper for a scientific audience, I can understand why the statistics are pretty challenging for people. And in fact, even people who've been professionals who've tried to critique our work, it's pretty clear that they didn't understand what we did. So kind of points that maybe they don't have the quantitative background or the scientific background to understand what we did.
Yeah, and one of the things that's important for parents to get is that, I said this earlier, every one of the conclusions from the Meyer team in the student edited journal, we turned it into a hypothesis because we were worried that, wow, is this really happening? And in law and in the philosophy of science, when you test a hypothesis, you don't confirm it, you test it to falsify it. If the data is there to support it, it's supported. But if the data is not there to support it, it's falsified, according to the philosophy of science and the way scientific methodology works. And as Professor Harmon said earlier, and what's critically important for parents to understand, after the peer review process that we went through, every one of the Meyer, of the things that made us really concerned in the Myers team student edited paper was falsified. Every one of them. Are judges doing a bad job? No, they're not. Are guardian ad litems ruining everything? No, they're not. Are moms who make complaints about being abused automatically losing their kids because dads say, oh no, it's alienation? No, that's not true. And it doesn't happen the other way around either. We looked at 1,000 cases rigorously. I suppose if the Meyer team's student edited paper could pass peer review, it would have done so by now, but it hasn't. So it's important for parents to understand, even though the statistics are difficult to grasp, and even though it's written in scientific language, what comes through is the stuff that we tested falsified.
Yeah, so like they just explained, the information on the paper may be a little bit complicated, but like the hypothesis, like they have tested the hypothesis. But I went through the data set, and like I said, you guys can also all get the data set. If you go to the paper, which is, the link is on our website, and in the paper, there's a link to the data set. So you can go directly to the data set and download the data. And I did that. And then I went through all the data, and I try to kind of look at the data and explain it in sort of the layman terms so that it's easier for parents to understand. And I found a number of things, and I want to share that with parents. And, feel free to jump in if you wanted to comment on any of this. So for example, out of that 1,000 cases, roughly, about 27% of the cases, parental alienation was actually brought up by the court. It didn't come up by neither of the parents. Nobody complained that there's alienation. The court looked at the case and noticed that, oh, this is an alienation situation, right? So the court does recognize, even without professionals involved, they do recognize parental alienation, right? Okay, and then out of that 1,000 cases roughly, there's about 23% is where parental alienation is proven by professionals. So, guardian ad litem therapists, psychologists, or things like that. Okay. So the other, I guess, thing is about the allegation of abuse, which is something that I guess Maya Works has been trying to push this sort of thing about, like, oh, parental alienation is only a term where abuser is using it. Abusive father is using the term parental alienation to cover up the abuse. So I was particularly curious about abuse cases. So out of these 1,000 cases, and for parents to know, these are all parental alienation cases. Out of these 1,000 cases, about 58%, there's no allegation whatsoever about abuse about the fathers. So it has nothing to do, like, this is not abusive father using this. Nobody's complaining. Like 58% of the cases, nobody complaining that the father is abusive. And 48.7% where there's no abuse allegation to either of the parents. So really, parental alienation and abuse are completely separate things. They're not related. It's not like, oh, I haven't.
Wait. Parental alienation is abuse, but you don't need to make an abuse allegation to have a parental alienation case.
Right. Sorry.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes. I guess my point is, like, it's not because, oh, now someone is being accused of physical or sexual abuse, then that's when they use parental alienation and pull it out and go to court with it. The point was, these 1,000 cases show us that more than half of it has nothing. There's no presence of discussion of physical or sexual abuse going on. It's just parental alienation cases. So there's that. And then out of these, about half of it has allegation of abuse. There's actually, so half of those that have allegation of abuse, which is 25% of this total 1,000 cases, actually the court found that the allegation is false. That they are unsubstantiated, that they are unfounded, or there's evidence that they are false allegation. So the way that I see it, it means that false allegation is actually quite common in parental alienation situation, which we do see in parents, and my parents sitting in the room right now talking about how they being accused by their exes for horrific things. And we talk to so many parents, and this is really painful. I mean, so and the data does show that actually in parental alienation, false allegations are actually quite common. Okay, so I think another set here. So the other things that I think Maya would claim that, mothers lose custody. This is like a gender thing. When it comes to parental alienation, mother will lose custody if she's being accused of alienation. So again, I look at your data, and I found that, let's see, how often do people lose custody? Not very often. I'm not sure where I put that data right now. I'm sorry, I misplaced that data. But okay, so they claim that abusive father use alienation as a tool to take custody away from mothers, claiming that the mother is alienating the child. And out of this whole entire data set, going back 10 years, there is one case where the mother is claimed to be the alienator who lost custody when the father is found to be abusive to the child. But she didn't lose custody to the father. She lost the custody to protective agency. So the child was placed in protective care because she was found to be also an unfit mother. So there's no case where the father was found to be abusive and the court take the child and give it to an abusive father. Out of this whole set of data, there's no case. So I thought that was really interesting because it's amazing the misinformation out there that made me really concerned.
Could I jump in on that too?
Yes, please.
Oh, wait. So I think what's really interesting too is we included anytime there was an allegation of abuse, whether it was domestic violence, whether it was physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, psychological abuse. because we know that parents can make all sorts of claims, right? You know, and I'm sure many of the people listening have been subjected to a lot of them. But what's interesting is we noticed when we were looking at the Meyer team's paper, they didn't include any neglect cases. They specifically said in their paper that they excluded neglect cases because it would confound the issue. And I don't know what that means. What confounds the issue? Because neglect is actually the most commonly reported type of abuse that there is. If you look at national statistics every year, 3/4 of allegations of abuse are neglect. And what's really interesting is that most of the people who claim neglect are fathers. So against mothers, right? So if you exclude 3/4 of the cases from your data set that represent, you know, a lot of cases of abuse, and you only include cases where there's child abuse or sex abuse, that's a very small piece of the pie, right? And then you've also excluded the cases where dads are saying there's abuse going on. What does that tell you? To me, that tells me that the team is possibly excluding cases where moms were abusive on purpose. I mean, I don't know, but it seems to be that way because I don't know any other explanation why you would exclude those cases. There's a lot of other issues with that, but we included all of them because, as you can see, the courts every day have to deal with all these allegations. They're dealing with so much stuff in their courtroom every day that it doesn't make any sense to narrow it down only to a particular type of abuse and then say that that type of abuse is happening all over the place. That you can't generalize. You can't say that that data set represents what the courts are dealing with. With our study, you can.
Right.
And actually, Pedro, let me jump in there for a second. When this kind of information comes to court, it has to come to court through the mouth of an expert. So when somebody wants to, let's suppose somebody comes in and they want to talk about the Harmon Lorando's paper, or they certainly you would want somebody who knows how to do that kind of work to talk about it, and you would test to find out if they're really an expert. When I teach lawyers and judges how to get to the bottom of whether it's junk science or good science with psychologists, for example, I help them understand how to take the ethical principles and code of conduct for psychologists and compare that to what the psychologist has done here. Now, with the Myers team student edited journal paper, one of the things that lawyers could do would be to take the research, to take the legal studies and the research into academic fraud and use that to compare and contrast. We know that academic fraud is a deliberate effort to deceive, and it's not honest differences of opinion. And academic fraud often involves failure to follow a protocol. Did that happen here? I don't know. Conscious misrepresentation of sources. Did that happen here? Check. Suppression of relevant evidence or data. Has that happened here? Check. Fabrication or falsification of data or results, like cooking the data. Did that happen here? Ask. Trimming the data. Did that happen here? Ask. Statistical manipulation. Did that happen here? Ask. Duplication of results by multiple submissions, you know, just kind of packaging it up and submitting it again under a different name. Are these the kinds of things that you would compare the research of into fraud with papers such as this? And if there were no correspondences, well, then maybe it's reliable. But if there are many correspondences, you really want to have those explained.
Right. And actually in the chat room, like Riff, she was talking about how this misinformation affected her personal case because she talked to 7 different attorneys and they all advised her the same thing, that if she's accused of alienation, she's gonna lose custody. And yeah, it is really, and so some of the parents was asking, how do you use this data, this information? And Dr. Lorandos just explained to you, you need to bring in an expert who can explain the data and the information to the court to get your case supported. And then also Elaine asked about how to reach out to Dr. Hammond. You can just message us and give us your information and we'll pass it on to her, no problem at all. You can contact us through Facebook or our website. There's a contact form. Just make sure you give us all of your information. That way we can just send it to her, no problem. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that comment that I forgot who you said it was said is important because a lot of attorneys are getting misinformation. They're being trained at misinformation and given false information, or I don't know if it's false, but very very wrong messages from attorneys that are being trained by associations that are kind of supporting the Meyer study. And I've seen this even recently. This last month there was a training in Michigan using Joan Meyer's study and giving advice to attorneys on how to litigate cases. And so it's sad because then parents are getting that message from attorneys who don't have the scientific background, most of them, to understand what is being miscommunicated to them. And so I think that's very disturbing. And I think that's something we should all be very worried about. I mean, we're kind of in a culture where that's happening, right? Not just in this area. We're in a culture where people don't trust science and a lot of it's due to not understanding it. And what Dr. Lorandos calls it cargo cult science, right? Where it's misuse of science and
pretend.
And so it's really important to I think, have an expert who understands science. If you have an attorney who doesn't get it, even just consult with someone like me or somebody else just for an hour to explain it. Just because then your attorney can understand, what is good science, what's bad science, how can they keep bad science out of the courtroom, and help and protect your case.
Right. I think that term Dr. Lorandos brought up in an interview that Ashish Joshi interviewed both of you, and that's available on YouTube that everyone can watch, right? Where you also talk about this. And you brought up the point about abuse, and I wanted to share that in your data set, I found that cases where parents that are supposedly the alienated parents that found to actually are abusive to the children, according to court, like the court actually found evidence that these alienated parents are abusive, is 9% in total, and 5% among that 9% is by the mothers, and 4% is by the fathers. So only really a small portion of the alienated parents are really truly found to be abusive, not the other way around. And also mothers are actually slightly more guilty of this. So there's no sort of gender bias here.
Right. We don't find gender differences, and I don't find gender differences in my other studies either on who's likely to be an alienating parent or who's likely to be a target. That's another mischaracterization that keeps floating around, that dads are the ones who are, claiming to be alienated and moms are being accused all the time. And that's not what we find. Right. Now, at the appellate case, though, you'll see in the paper, we do say that there, and Dr. Lorandos has published about this. And when you look at the greater body of studies, there are more cases where mothers are found to be the alienating parent at the appeal level. I think it was 70% of your cases. But that could be for a lot of reasons. It could be because maybe financially the fathers were able to fight it, or could afford to go to the appeals. It could be because there were biases involved with assessment. And in another paper, Dr. Lorandos and I published last year, we found that moms and dads alienate differently. So they do different types of abusive behaviors differently. Women in general are much more indirect. they like to destroy reputations of people. They like to, gossip, and women use a lot more indirect forms of aggression than men. Men are more direct, right? And they're much more, kind of direct in that way. And so it's easier to identify when a dad is doing something than a mom, right? And so it'd be harder for fathers. It makes sense that it would be harder for fathers to prove that in court. So it makes sense then that they might be in court and having to battle longer to show that alienation is going on. So I think there's a couple explanations. We don't know. Right now, we're actually replicating the study that we're talking about today in Canada, because in Canada, they have trial level cases that we can look at. In the US, we don't. They don't publish all the trial level cases. So in Canada, they do. So we can look to see, are there gender differences there when you go lower down? We don't know yet. So we'll know hopefully in about a year. It takes a long time. And in that study, we have a lot of French cases too. So those take a while to code.
Translation.
Right. But I think what is important, especially because it takes a long time too, because we're trying to do this in as transparent of a way as possible, right? We code everything. We make sure everything is meticulously done, just because we know that the detractors out there are looking for anything to poke a hole in, right? So we're trying to be as very careful as we can. And it's just important to do good science anyway, right? I think if you're going to make policy decisions and decisions that make choices that we make for families, it's got to be good science. And it's so important to do that and be transparent about it.
Let me talk about that just a little bit, okay? Can I talk about that in a minute?
Yeah. Yep.
One of the problems in our culture of misinformation, Alondra Nelson, PhD, and Jane Lubchenco, PhD, who are now working in the White House in the Office of Science and Technology, wrote a letter about 10 days ago to all the federal agencies in the United States that deal with science, and saying, look, you've got to have rigorous methodology. You've got to be careful about how you do science, because as Dr. Lubchenco said, quote, we know that there were blatant attempts to distort, to cherry pick, and to disregard science, unquote. When I looked at that quote, I thought, wow, that sounds familiar. So when professional groups create panels to discuss science, one needs to ask, do they know how to do this kind of science? Do they know how to even read it? How would you feel if a cook at Burger Chef was asked to judge a French pastry contest? They're just out of their depth. We discover, if we look at some of the misinformation that happens, if we look at like 3 law professors, for example, in the last 20 years, we've got Carol Bruck, who's a social worker, then a law professor. We've got Joan Meyer, who got a BA with honors in government and then a law degree. We've got Adrian Barnett, who got a BA in English and then a diploma in law and then a PhD in law and politics. And they all published what they suggested was science. But we know the research tells us that there's no science curriculum in law school. None of these people have a background in science. So they have what researchers call, they may have, I don't know, you have to test this, but they may have what researchers call meta-ignorance. That is, that they don't know what they don't know. And research also tells us, and you would have to compare this research to them if you got a chance to cross-examine them, what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people vastly overestimate their competence, their ability to discern things, and and people that really know what they're doing tend to keep their light under a bushel basket. But the Dunning-Kruger effect tells us that incompetent people vastly overestimate their competence, And the next thing that we see happen is what scientists call hermeneutical ignorance, which is a fancy term which means willful blindness. And they come to court and they say, I don't see any good research about parental alienation. I haven't heard any good information about parental alienation. And it's essentially a dishonest way of looking at what's out there. Then they do what's called confirmatory bias. They only look for what fits their ideas, and then they veer out of their lane. You have law professors who don't know about science but think they do. veering out of their lane and talking about science. Well, you know, when you veer out of your lane, accidents happen.
Right.
Yeah, so parents are asking in the room, like, how do we use this? The reason we are going through all of this is so that you can actually use this in your case. Because if that information, misinformation is being used in your case, here are the arguments that you need to actually lay it out for your case.
Mhm.
The other things, there's a
I think,
question, I think, by
oh,
Edwin. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say another thing that I think is important is that this study that the Meyer team published, and then two other papers that she published alone. I don't know why her authors or other authors were dropped from it. Usually you don't do that, because if you contribute to the intellectual work of something, you should still be credited. So she published two other papers, but they were essentially republications. One was just a republication, a rehashing of the other paper, just providing a few more details about the search string, but still no statistics are provided in that paper. And then just this last month, another paper was published, essentially rehashing the same study, which as a scientist, you would never do, ever.
And as somebody that's cross-examining this, if somebody comes to court and they do this sort of thing, you compare duplicate or multiple submissions with the research into scientific and academic fraud. There's a vast research about scientific and academic fraud and research fraud, part of which says duplicate or multiple submissions, particularly when you change the name.
Right. Yeah, and the American Psychological Association says that by doing that, by trying to repackage the same material, you're trying to make it look more legitimate than it is. Trying to make your study and the findings appear more like they have higher significance and they warrant more attention. And that is a big no-no. That's not ethical. But I think the other thing that I was going to kind of point out is that there's a big concern, because at the end of the Meyer team's paper, they put a call out to change laws, child abuse and domestic violence laws, so that parental alienation is no longer trained. It's taught to other people as junk science or pseudoscience, that you can't admit it in court. And that's happening right now. So if you are a parent and these laws pass in your state, you won't have any protection when you go to court. None. You won't be able to get an expert to go in there to even talk about alienation. So I think that's something that everybody needs to be horrified about and do something about. Because if that happens where you live, you won't have any recourse at all to fight for your children.
So, so the detractors are what they're trying to, it's the detractors that are doing the junk science, clearly not the people. Remember, people have been doing research about parental alienating behaviors since the 1940s. Parental alienation behaviors, undercutting the relationship of a child with the other parent, have been happening in the courts for more than 200 years. And now a radical group is trying to, on the basis of a couple of student edited journal papers, is trying to set, which we think have all been falsified, the conclusions have all been falsified, but on the basis, they're touting this sort of thing, and they're trying to change laws. So 200 years of jurisprudence, 70 years worth of science is blocked. You can't bring it in. Don't do it. Seems crazy, but so is voter suppression and white supremacy.
Right.
I think there's some parent in the chat room that mentioned that they're seeing it in the law right now in Maryland, and I definitely saw that in Connecticut. I think there's a bill that's being introduced right now where they're trying to say that if a parent that is complaining that the other parent is influencing the relationship between the child and them, then they are not allowed to testify there, and the court is not allowed to take the child away from the alienators, and the court is not allowed to provide support to allow the alienated parents to get reunification with the child. And the reference is referencing back to this paper. I think it was in also in Maryland, like someone mentioned. Elaine's talking about in Colorado, there's another bill where I think, I don't know if it has been updated yet, but there's a bill that actually stated, that the bill is asking the judges to not get training in parental alienation, and the judges have to acknowledge that parental alienation is junk science. So this is kind of interesting to me because when parental alienation is being called junk science by the people that are not scientists.
I know. Isn't that crazy? Jeez.
So and I don't know, I feel I mean, I'm looking at this as just a parent, so but I just feel like, I mean, when you look at abuse in the personal level, you have gaslighting, right? So the abuser will make you feel like this is not real. So kind of this is in the macro scale, it's the same thing. It's saying parental alienation is not real. I mean, we have all these parents here that are coming to us, and really for the longest time they had no idea what it is. They know it's real because it's their personal experience. And by the time they come to us, they look at what is said about parental alienation to go, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going through. So whether the science acknowledge or not, these parents' experience is very real. It's out there. So yeah, right. So that's one thing. The other thing is, like we just talked about, on the personal level, in an abusive relationship, there's this thing called projection. The abuser will blame the victims for what they do. So it's kind of interesting in the macro scale. It's like parental alienation is being called junk science by non-scientists, and it's being spread around in the media that have no scientific basis for their publication, and we're seeing it in the mainstream media as well.
Oh yeah. Well, even in the grant application that Joan Meyer submitted to the Department of Justice, in the abstract, which you can see online, she says that parental alienation research is pseudoscience, which is a complete misrepresentation of over 35 years, or if you even go back to 1943 when the first paper was out, where we didn't even call it alienation, but they're documenting scientifically the behaviors that we today call alienation. That is willfully misrepresenting the scientific research.
And it's in legal parlance, according to the model rules of professional responsibility, you can't overtly misrepresent the state of law. So when you have non-scientists overtly misrepresenting the state of the science, one would argue that that's not ethical. But that doesn't seem to stop people who have an agenda and are non-scientists, because they, judges, what our research demonstrated, and my previous research in 4 or 5 different books and articles demonstrates, is that judges really do get this. They really know. They don't care whether you call it parental alienation or you call it resist and refuse or you call it brainwashing. They get it, and they really try hard to come up with a reasonable solution. And I personally felt that it was my opinion that the conclusions that the Myers team put out in the student edited journal were insulting to these hard-working judges. And instead of dealing with these judges, they want to do an end run around behind the judges to politicians and have the politicians put a fence around what the judges can do. And in my estimation, that's the road to ruin.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an article on Forbes magazine recently that again cited this work, and also is essentially saying parental alienation is not real. And that's sort of really concerning me, because we're talking about a very mass media here, the Forbes magazine, that has so much readership out there, and yet denying and silencing so many victims that we know in person. Like, we know these parents, we can see them in the chat room right now. And for parents, if you are concerned about this article, I do recommend that you go onto Forbes magazine, and they have the editorial editorial email that you can email them. It's readers@forbes.com, and you can voice your opinion, however you feel about it, because the paper essentially said parental alienation is not real. And we're talking about, I mean, just us alone, our audience is big, and we are a tiny little thing in this whole scale of the number of the victims out there. So definitely. Let's see, what else should we cover?
Well, wait a minute, Petra, wait a minute.
Yes.
Remember what happened to Galileo? Remember what happened to Copernicus? The folks that had their own particular pet beliefs, which were all wrong, really resented the ever-living daylights out of Galileo, Copernicus, Leeuwenhoek, Lister.
You need to go into a specific. Let's talk about Galileo. Okay, can you explain? So back then go ahead. Yeah.
Galileo demonstrated a variety of different basic scientific principles. Copernicus demonstrated that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth. And the church at the time didn't like that at all because it conflicted with their teaching. So they imprisoned these people. We're experiencing bigly the same cultural phenomenon here, where there's blatant attempts to distort and to cherry pick and to disregard science in the service of a particular agenda. And that agenda seems to me to be based on inaccurate information about what's actually happening. The judges know that the courts have been dealing with this for 200 years. The guardians ad litem know that the courts have been dealing with this for 200 years. The expert witnesses who are ethical know that the courts have been dealing with this for 200 years. The expert witnesses know that this has been, unless they are, the kind of folks that do this, they know that the social scientists and psychiatrists have been publishing about this for 70 years, calling it different names, but the phenomena is basically the same. I mean, Professor Harmon and Professor Matheson wrote a fabulous chapter in the new book, Parental Alienation, Science and Law, describing what these behaviors are. It doesn't matter what you call it. And, take it from me, I'm the editor of the last 3 books on parental alienation, handbooks. It doesn't matter if you call it chopped liver. We know as victims of this kind of brainwashing, undercutting, alienation, that it's child abuse. And we want to try to stop child abuse. So unfortunately, people that have an axe to grind and have a particular agenda who are not scientists cannot do scientists, because after all, if the Meyer team could pass peer review, they would have done so by now, I think.
So in the chat room, Laurie is sharing the link to the Forbes article. So, parents, if you guys want to check that out in the chat room. And like I said, if you have an opinion about that article, if it concerns you, then please email to readers@forbes.com. And then your point about the history, it's so true. And I mean, I think of this all the time. Like, for example, Newton discovered gravity. It doesn't matter how much you hate Newton, gravity exists. You can say he's the most abusive person, he's a drunk, he's whatever. You can hate the guy. It doesn't change the fact that gravity exists. And it is the same thing about parental alienation. You can try to attack the scientists behind it. The phenomena is real. And it's a real problem, it's a real form of abuse. The other thing is that Dr. Lorandos mentioned about the book, Parental Alienation, Science and Law. If you guys have trouble finding it, go on our website. Again, under the information tab, you will find the link to that book so you can see it. And it's a very thorough, very good book with covering really all aspects of parental alienation.
Could I comment and expand a little bit more on something that Demos said about the church? And because I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now with the people who are defending the Meyer team's work. And this happened with a professional association just like in January, I believe it was, or early February, where an association told us that they were going to have 3 neutral members of their organization critique our work for their members. Now, we had actually said, hey, we're happy to go and talk about our work to your members, and explain it, just like you would at a conference, where just like we're doing right now, we're happy here to explain anything about our work to you. But they didn't want that. They wanted their people to interpret the work for their audience, which I think is dangerous, in my opinion, because science isn't political, but when you editorialize it and have people editorialize it, then it becomes political. And this association did that. And unfortunately, we looked at who these people were, and they did not have the CVs or the resumes to indicate that they had the qualifications to understand even what we did. I know they didn't publish any quantitative scientific journals, or if they did publish anything, they were largely descriptive papers with percentages of cases and published in professional journals. Or there are attorneys who don't have the scientific background, or they weren't peers. They were not people that would give a scientific analysis. And yet what was horrifying is these people critiqued our work with claims that were not even true, and it seemed as if they didn't even read our work or understand it. And one of them, just 2 weeks ago, did a law presentation with Joan Meyer herself. Not exactly a neutral person to critique our work. So that was really terrifying, because it's like the church it's like this institution who's playing along with this narrative that alienation's not real. And anybody who has good science that says it is vilified. And and there's a lot of us who do this work who are being attacked in that way right now. And it's very sad.
One of the premier researchers in parental alienation, the Harvard-trained psychiatrist, Bill Burnett, sent an email around to the people who are the bigwigs in this organization and said, hey, you guys keep saying that people have differences of opinion and that people are calling things by different names. Let's get together at your next conference, and we'll bring some folks, and you bring some folks, and let's get together. And every person he sent the email to in this group said, oh, I don't know, I think my mom is calling, I gotta have lunch, I didn't hear you, goodbye, I don't know. But they were completely unavailable to do that. And when they originally said to Jennifer and I, hey, would you like to participate in this? I came up with the idea that I don't want to cook at Burger Chef judging a French pastry contest. I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, and I could clearly be mistaken. I mean, I'm a husband. I'm used to being mistaken. I don't think that any of the people that they picked do quantitative, actually do it and publish it. And, I'm a lot older than Jennifer. I mean, my first quantitative analyses were published decades ago. And it's important that if you're going to critique it, you have to be able to do it. Not just say you know how to do it, but you have to be able to do it. And so we thought, wow, this doesn't seem right. And then when we looked at the slides that they created and listened to some of their presentation, we thought, hey, wait a minute, where have we heard this before? And it came right out of a rebuttal that some of the, it was just.
It was some comments, I think, that were written on social media that were not peer reviewed.
That's the quality of the analysis.
In support of what the Meyer team did.
Now, would you take that? I mean, in law, we give various weight to the opinions that are offered. If you can get past voir dire and be accepted as an expert, some expert opinion is not worth as much as the other. So, I don't think in any of the presentation that we were invited to participate in, and we thought, whoa, wait a minute. Nobody asked what's the basis of the opinion. Nobody asked what are the sources. Nobody asks, are these sources accurate? Nobody asks, are they valid? Nobody asks, are they reliable? And it seemed to us that they hadn't even read what we wrote. So it was very disheartening. And you know, when you have misinformation supercharged and pushed out by a professional organization, it's very disheartening, particularly when you say, hey, let's get together and talk about it. And they're all running for the door, running for the exit, saying, oh, well, I'm sorry, I'm busy. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Right. Yeah. If you want to critique what parental alienation is and claim that there's no consensus, then come to the table to find consensus. Don't run away and continue to point a finger and say there is no consensus. When you have everybody who's, all of us, you know, that we said yes, you know, that we're invited, but the people who are the biggest loudmouths saying, no, it's not scientific and we don't know enough. We don't have enough research yet to make any decisions. They're not willing to come to the table. And in fact, part of the invitation was, let's figure out what we disagree on and come up with what the scientific evidence needs to be in order to come to agreement. Let's do that. Let's work together so that we can help families. Like, let's do this so that we can put this to rest. And they ran for the hills. They didn't want to participate. And it's very frustrating because then, you know, people like Demos and I are accused by these professionals as being, you know, in the minority opinion, and that we're these radicals. And yet, you know, I've tried to invite people that I don't agree with to a conference I just hosted in December. Half the people didn't even respond to my request. And I invited people who disagreed with most of what we do, most of the research, and they didn't even respond to the email to just come and talk, have an open dialogue. I've been invited to give talks at a domestic violence conference recently, to be a keynote, to talk to practitioners about alienation, because the people who invited me recognized that we are talking about domestic violence. We just have a different name for it. One of the people who funds that conference is a detractor of alienation, found out about it and told the organizer that they were going to pull the funding unless they took me off the list of speakers. This is the suppression of science that's happening. And it's happening when I've offered to go and give talks at task forces about alienation, task forces that are creating bills for the government in order to change domestic violence laws. And advocates are in there saying, using Joan Meyer's paper to say, look, no, alienation is just a false claim of abuse. It's not scientific, or it's a false claim that dads make to get out of abuse claims. It's pseudoscientific, and I'm blocked from even going to share the research. So it's a very scary time right now, and I think we should all be concerned about it.
Well, what you're illustrating in social psychology, it's called the backfire effect. It's also called by social psychologists belief perseverance. And the backfire effect is very simple to determine. You know, it's just when you thought statistics and data mattered. If you ask someone what their opinion is, like let's say you ask a detractor about their opinion that it's not admissible, for example, then they say, oh no, parental alienation is junk science and it's not admissible. Okay, well then you show them a publication from April 2020 of 1,142 cases where judges said it's admissible, it's important, it's probative, it's relevant, it's material, it's admissible, it matters. Instead of changing their opinion and saying, oh, wow, okay, the backfire effect says it drives them further into their opinions. You know, like stop the steal, the election was fraudulent, it's this sort of Sidney Powell, you know, release the Kraken. Get those legislators to say you can't talk about parental alienation, release the Kraken. And then when you actually get them on the stand and you pin them down and you question them about their belief system, they don't have anything to stand on. There's no reliable data. They don't know what their sources are, or they're repeating the same debunked stuff over and over and over again. And then they say, oh no, that's what you're doing. It's sort of the Sean Hannity, but what about? And so we're in a very difficult cultural moment now where this is happening in so many ways, which is why Alondra Nelson and Jane Lubachenko said that there's been a blatant attempt to distort, to cherry pick, and to disregard science. And that's what parents who are trying to make this case are feeling. It's a cultural issue. And so when you try to talk to the association people and they run for the door, or they create panels of folks who don't know how to do this, but say they do.
Yeah. And then they go and train people. They train lawyers and judges on misinformation. And that, I think, is the most terrifying part. That gets to what the person wrote in that chat.
I mean, yeah, like our audience
that.
see that all the time because, you know, they always complain about how therapists don't get this, psychologists don't get this, and their lawyers don't get this. It's so hard for parents to get the right kind of help, the right kind of team around them, because getting people that really become aware and understand this is difficult. So there's a question in the room about the science. I think someone asked, I lost that question now, but about are there somewhere where there's, you know, lists of scientific work on this field. So there's a database that hosted by the Vanderbilt University. It's called Parental Alienation Database that you can get access to really anything to do with this field. And then also Parental Alienation Study Group has a section called resources. So you can go on there, and there's also a list of different things. On there, there's a lot of, you know, studies and summaries of what the studies mean. A number of groups also release a number of information sheets that you can find it on our website under the information or downloadable tab. So there's information sheets that explain different aspects of it, and under each there's you know, the list of articles or scientific references, and that's actually collaborative work by multiple organizations that put together to try to bring this to light. There's also just a few days ago, I did a review of all the quantitative study, scientific study on the impact of parental alienation on children, short-term and long-term impact, and how it is a form of psychological abuse on the children. So if you guys missed that, you can check that in our video tab. We're going to cover a lot more. So there's a lot of information out there, parents, so you can find it. So the question I want to bring up from the chat room is about the rebuttal. How do you say that word? I don't know. The response. They are asking, is John Mayer responding to you? Apparently she's preparing a response. Have you received the response? Or, you know, can you talk a little? I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier, but let's just address that.
Well, the journal, as most journals do, if someone critiques someone's work, they invite the other author to respond. There has not been a published response yet in the Psychology, Public Policy, and Law Journal. It's been a couple months. And the way that works is if you're asked to write a response, then you submit it, and then a panel of reviewers determines if it's meritorious, right? Or if it's scholarly, if it's scientifically acceptable to publish. And if it's not, they'll either reject it or they'll send it back and say, this needs to be revised. And then they might revise it, send it back, and the journal may or may not accept it, because if the arguments sent to the journal aren't valid or just attacks or anything like that, then they won't accept that. And then if it's accepted, then we would be asked to respond back. So that's how science works. You usually have a dialogue in the scientific journal, but that hasn't happened yet. And so the only thing I've seen that someone had sent to me was a rebuttal that was, I think, written by the Meyer team, and it was published on a website that is aligned with the advocacy groups that I think Professor Meyer's part of. I forgot what the name of the website is, but the court said or something like that. So it's a friendly website. It's not a peer-reviewed site. So it appears to have been published to try to get, I don't know, maybe court of public opinion about it. And when I did look at what the arguments that were made there are, and again, it's kind of like if a lawyer looked at me writing about law, they would say that person's clearly not a lawyer. I looked at the response and I said, this person's clearly not a scientist, and I didn't understand the criticism or the critique that we made. And we didn't, and I want to remind everybody, this isn't an ad hominem attack. We didn't make any ad hominem attack against her as a person or the people as a person, as a team. We just criticized the work, which is what everybody should do. We should always try to do better science, because if you're making decisions and policies on science, you've got to understand that science is good or not. And if it's not, you have to be able to stand up to criticism about it and defend it.
Right.
That's why
one thing that we did not say, we did not say, and we would not say Joan Myers is the Q of family law research. We didn't say that, this is kind of the Sidney Powell argument. We didn't do any of those kinds of things. We simply said, wait a minute, if you compare methodology to methodology, they're radically different. And we did it scientifically and falsified all of their conclusions, and did so in a rigorous methodological way. And it's just straight up peer-reviewed, legitimate science. And the other side, we have a student-edited law journal paper. And so, but the degree to which they're ginning this up as though it means something, it's sort of like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in the Ghostbusters, movie. It's really just hollow marshmallow.
Yeah, I looked at what was written in the rebuttal, and some of it was just crazy attacks on us, calling us non-feminist or, gender bashing, essentially, and I'm a feminist, I take total offense to that, just because we took a very gender neutral approach. And I think that really, that comment that I read really emphasizes, I think, what's driving this resistance and what drives what our detractors are doing. It boils down to this just gender belief that moms are not abusive or women are not abusive. And if they do use aggression, it's only in self-defense. And that men don't use aggression in self-defense. They only use it to exert power and control over women. And that when women are alienating their children, they're just doing it to protect them from abusive men. And time and again, that is what all of these kind of boil down to. And it doesn't, the data on the statistics on who's a victim of domestic violence doesn't support that argument. What is used, and sometimes, I've seen in some reports that people try to file to change laws, they file like analyses that a website does or like an advocacy group does, and you don't know exactly where they pulled their data from to even draw some of the conclusions that they're drawing. So you can't trust where the data came from. And first of all, you don't know how they do their analyses, so you can't even verify it. And they're citing it as if it's valid arguments or valid data, and yet unfortunately, and reliable, and yet there's no way to verify it. And sadly, if you don't know that, and if you're not somebody who's very critical, and you look at that, you might be, oh my God, moms are just being abused left and right, and kids are, just, you think that abuse happens all the time, and child abuse actually doesn't happen very often. It's not as often as you think it is, but it's portrayed to be that way, and I think that there's reasons why. There's a lot of money there, to be gained by, for groups that support victims. And bear in mind, I'm not saying that, child abuse isn't bad. Of course it is. It's horrible, right? We don't want that. We don't want any kind of abuse. But you have to look at base rates. You have to look at how often it actually is reported. And when you look nationwide on a yearly basis, it's actually not that common.
And the
in
problem,
family.
Yeah, the problem is parental alienation is a subset of child abuse. It is a subset of domestic violence.
Right. And it's still, if you look at it, it's about 2 to 3% maybe of children. And that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's 2 or 3 of the population,
Right.
And that's a lot.
Yeah.
But still, that's, it's, there's a lot of healthy people out there. There's fortunately a lot of people who can co-parent and do right. fortunately.
Yeah.
But we're talking here about people who are not in that boat, right? We're in a different situation, right?
Yeah. So
but I
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I mean your paper. In your paper, in the table 1, you identify 30. How would I call those? 30, I guess, misrepresentation or scientific inaccuracy with John Myers' study. So you published on that table 1 30 items that is wrong with that paper, and your paper is peer reviewed in a scientific journal. And the response to that is not in a scientific forum, but it's being spread around in social media.
Yes, correct. Yep.
And
there isn't.
Wait a minute. One of the complaints, when you look into social media, one of the complaints was, well, Harmon Larondos did not use our 11-line query to carefully look at this, the phenomenon. And Professor Harmon and I looked at this and we thought, wait a minute, Occam's razor? Who uses an 11-line query? Nobody does that. But we said, okay, well, let's do it. And we asked Myers for the query. What's the query? Send it to us. And they blew us off. But then they criticized us for not using it. So when it came out in one of these multiple publications someplace else, we got it. And we looked at what they said, how the databases they used to run it. We ran it on exactly that database and we got gibberish. So we ran it on another database, got more gibberish. It's sort of like 1,000 monkeys and 1,000 typewriters.
Right.
Yeah.
So
then we finally
just to clarify that for parents, what he was talking about is, for example, imagine you go to Google and if you type in there alienation, or if you type in there parental alienation, or if you type in there parental, you have different results. So if you wanted to figure out what set of result that you do analysis on, you need to use a particular set of search string, which is what he was just talking about, and that will lead you to the set of 1,000 cases that we are just talking about right now to decide these are the alienation cases. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, and this is I think that's a good example of kind of gaslighting, right? So the Meyer original paper came out September of 2019. A member of our team emailed the Meyer team and asked her for that search string. So if you go to Google and you type in what you use to get your cases, we asked her for it because it was not published in that report. And she didn't give it to us. And you can see that whole email correspondence on Open Science Framework. It's up there, so you can go and read. In fact, her response is actually quite disturbing. So you can go on and see what that was about. But that's beside the point. So then in January of 2020, after we had already started our paper, so we had already launched our study. We had pre-registered everything on Open Science Framework. We had designed everything. We were ready to go. And we couldn't directly replicate what she did because they didn't give us what they did. And so then we come to learn finally, January 2020, she finally publishes the search string. But by then we had already done our study, right? We had already collected our samples. And so then to accuse us of saying later that we never used it, when actually, if you look in our paper, we do say we tried it. Before we published the paper, we tried it. And you'll see it in a footnote. It's right there. We talk about it. So just stating that alone on social media indicates that they didn't really read the paper. And saying it out on social media, they're probably trusting that their audience isn't going to read our paper either. So well, it's a deliberate, it's kind of a misleading statement. Maybe they read the paper, but they are saying it.
In fairness to them, in fairness to many of the people that are reading what the student edited law journal paper, they probably do not have, or at least they don't demonstrate the ability to actually do science or understand science. And so what we wrote is science, and it thanks to people like you, Petra, we have a chance to talk to parents and we have a chance to break it down because frankly, this is PhD level science. This is peer reviewed science.
And so, what do you want to take to the bank? Do you want to take student-edited law review journal, or do you want to take peer-reviewed science? I mean,
Okay.
and if you don't understand the science, put a question up on the Open Science Framework, and one of us will respond.
Oh yeah, and that's something I should point out too. You can look on our page, project page. Two of the authors of the Meyer paper actually posted questions to us, and we answered them. And so you can go on and see our answers to the questions that they gave to us about our data set. And they had emailed us directly about it, but we wanted it to be open and transparent. We didn't want our responses to be misconstrued. Not that they would do that, but we want to make sure that that's not done. And so we've moved everything onto Open Science Framework. And so you can go on there. Anybody can go on and post questions that you have about it. And I think that's important to do in general, so that people can, I think it's useful information for everybody else to see what questions other people are asking, right? And I think the point you raised earlier, Petra, is also important in that, I know it's hard for people who aren't scientists to understand sometimes the scientific papers that are out there. And a lot of the journals and maybe this might be why a lot of detractors don't know what's published, because a lot of journals are hard to get. Like they're not publicly available, right? And so you have to pay to get an article. Or you have to pay to get the whole journal, and that's just very expensive. And that's unfortunate, because policymakers then who need the science can't get it. And this is a big problem across all of science. And this is part of open science practices right now, is they're trying to make availability, open accessibility part of that. Because if people can't access data and access science, it's a problem for society in general, right? And then if you even get it, you have to then have somebody help interpret it sometimes, because, there's some statistics that I don't know how to interpret. And I wouldn't review those papers. I would send it to somebody who understood it so that they would review it. And I'm an editor. I've been an editor for several psych journals, and I'm about to start another editorial board position just this summer. And if you get a paper that comes your way and you don't have the statistical expertise to evaluate it, or you're not familiar with that theory or research, you have to ethically decline it. It's ethical for you to say, I do not understand this. I can review this part of the paper, but somebody else with a statistical background who understands this needs to evaluate that. But that's an ethical scientific journal, right? That would be the ethical practices.
Let me say something about that. One of the reasons that we brought out Parental Alienation, the Handbook for Legal and Mental Health Professionals in 2013 was because we wanted to bring together all of the research and break it down so parents and experts who do not know how to do this kind of science could get it in a palatable form. We did that again in 2020 in Parental Alienation, Science and Law. I mean, the Parental Alienation, Science and Law has hundreds and hundreds of footnotes and endnotes to the peer-reviewed science, but it's written in a way that people who are not scientists can understand it. So it's readily available and it's broken down. And the database that you described is clearly available to folks. You have books by Mandy Matheson and her team in Australia. You have books by Ashish Joshi and Linda Gottlieb. You've got lots. You've got all the books by Amy Baker that break down the science and explain study after study after study. And then you have other folks in professional organizations who say, well, I've looked and I can't see any good science about this. And I haven't heard anything about good science about this. That's
so in the chat room, Mira was saying that it would be useful to be able to send key clips from this presentation to legislative staffers, for example, in Maryland. So Mira, for example, if you go onto our Facebook page, you will see that we create a statement that was sent to Texas legislators. So, we have that, or you can go to, like I mentioned, our website. There are single pages, information sheet about parental alienation. There are a few of them. One of them is Parental Alienation is Real. So they're just like bullet points essentially with explanation of different aspects of parental alienation, as well as a list of scientific citations and the explanation of the methodology for each of those scientific paper, as well as the finding for those. So it's very easy to see. It's bullet point. You can find it on our website, like I mentioned. Just go into the information tab, and in the downloadable, there are 3 of them. There's also infographics that we produce, which is like very visually interesting, easy to see. So that is helpful if you wanted to share that with school teachers or things like that. You can get that. And then all the books, like Dr. Lorando's just referenced all those books. Just a few days ago, we developed a worksheet for parents to use to look at the 5-factor models. It's available for free on Kindle, so you can find that as well. And we did a video where we walk through the workbook explaining to you how you can look at the 5-factor models and how you can keep records for your case. So there's a lot of information around. If you're not already on our mailing list, join our mailing list, and we always distribute that kind of information. Yeah, is there any last thoughts before we go? Do you
I'm
wanna
tired.
I know you're 2 hours ahead of me, so
It is
it's
late.
late.
Yeah,
I know
no,
we could talk about this all day. I mean, I'm happy to answer any other questions, and questions might come to people after this, so I'm happy to field them later as they come to you, and
So we have 412 comments so far. So I'm happy to send the link of this to you. Oh, now 413 comments so far. So yeah, feel free to I don't know if you have time to answer all of those, but I'll send you the link so that
maybe
you
I
can
can get my
see.
grad student to do it for me.
Right, but parents, what she's saying is that you guys can post questions now or later to this video, and she's gonna check it out. And if there are things that she can help you guys with, she will comment, or she'll get people to help, and we're gonna check that out as well. And so yeah, feel free to leave comments. And yes, Michelle said, I need a margarita. Yeah, we all need a drink or something. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here today, because it's such an in-depth, and we did warn the parents that it was going to be a long talk, that it was going to be very in-depth. So like I said, we're going to post an article on our website that give you the link to the paper as well as this video and all that, so that if you are looking for that kind of things, will hopefully it's clearer for you. But yeah, thank you so much, and good night, everyone. Yeah,
Night. Bye-bye.